think we're finally on.
Okay.
So this is allow me to introduce Andrei, and
hi.
I'm excited for you to meet in this.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. It's
format.
An honor to be here with you. It's an honor to chat. So we rewatched the documentary last night, so I've seen it a couple times now, and really enjoyed it. I guess we could start with, do you have a certain way you want to start, Father Vladimir, or do you mind if we just kick it off?
And I will add my thoughts and feelings and maybe some additional information, and definitely reflect on this film.
All right, so I'll start. The first thing that occurred to me that stuck out, and I really enjoyed the documentary. I thought it was really well made. It was a unique approach to documentaries. They're not usually done in this way. So your father was very much influenced by poetry. That was the first thing that stuck out to me, because I don't usually hear filmmakers talking about poetry. But what were some of the key literary influences on him? Because he does make a lot of literature references. And I think, was it your grandmother or grandfather that was, is it that your grandmother that was a literary student?
Well, both.
Okay.
They met at the literature courses led by Brusov, a famous poet in the beginning of the 20th century. Although my grandfather was a poet, so yes, of course, he was the main influence for his inspiration for poetry. Although, yes, but I think it's very important to underline just before we start that my father considered himself, first of all, a poet rather than a film director or artist, and so he said that once you're a poet, you can. And I think it's his example as well. Once a person has a poetic view, he can express his artistic idea in any field. I think that he would have been a good musician, conductor, as he used to say, or I don't know, painter or something else. But although he finds himself involved into the cinema in the cinema school. And there, I think, he'll elaborate his poetic language, his really particular way of seeing the cinema, and as he wrote in his book "Sculpting in Time," that's the idea, just cinema is the only art that actually deals with time, with the concept of time, which is very important for him, and so that's actually. His background, of course, comes from my grandfather, who was a poet, and my grandmother was actually after my father was born and his sister was born. She actually abandoned her literary studies, and he actually dedicated herself totally to the family, to raising my father, to give them the education, artistic education. My father was in music school, as you've seen in the documentary. He's talking about that, especially this kind of a very strong sacrifice that my grandmother did for her. Actually, she burned all her writings the day he was born. So that actually was his abdication in the name of motherhood. And and of course, my grandfather, who left the family, my father was 2 years old. It was kind of a childhood trauma for him, very hard period. But although the connection, the artistic connection, poetic connection, he was always looking forward toward his father, and that was actually something that goes through like a red line through all his movies. And yeah, as you know, in every movie there is a quote, a poem, or something related to Andrei Tarkovsky. And so that's actually was his idea, and that's I will always start with, that saying that my father was a poet before, and that's why his legacy belongs more to literature than film directors that actually were before. So his masters belongs to literature work. So it's and especially I think when we speak about Tarkovsky, we have to remember this silver age of Russian culture, of Russian philosophy, religious philosophy, which goes back to Berdyaev, Solovyov, Florensky. Is one of those were his teachers somehow. somehow he was to find him and to define him as an artist, as a thinker. Also, I think he has a very strong visual philosophy in his elaborated actually philosophical ideas in his films. So that goes back to that period and to that segment of Russian culture.
Now, Andrei, is it true that your grandfather is actually reading the poems in the films, the voice behind the camera in
Absolutely.
some cases?
My grandfather,
his name is Arseny Tarkovsky.
In the Mirror, actually, that was him. And in my film, he reads his poems. Actually, the choice of the poems which I used was the choice of the poems for the Mirror, but they didn't get into the film. So it was here in archives, in my father's archives. Actually, he asked my grandfather to record, and they recorded a session of chosen poems. So that's the poems I used in my movie was chosen by my father for the Mirror, but they never make it into the movie. So that's why I chose it. And my grandfather, of course, wrote them. Actually, it was very difficult for him to record because he didn't like much reading his poems. So there is a few recordings, in Soviet Union, they used to make this Melodia recordings on the vinyl discs and this one disc. And they made a very particular job. And I remember that my father stressed my grandfather quite a bit just to record properly and to read those poems.
You had a studio recording, or was it a home setting?
No, it was a studio recording at film studios, yes.
And it's very nice to see some of the shots in your film, film as an icon, that a film as a prayer that we're talking today about. We will also let people know where they might be able to see it. But it's very unique shots of the notebooks of your grandfather in his own handwriting, with dates like 30s, like written by his own hand in a very personal type of. Do you have records of these poems in writing in your possession?
Well, yeah, actually, all the documents that I used in the film are coming from our archives, my father's archives. So I have his handwriting poems here in Florence, and I used them. I showed those papers. I'm just quite curious that my grandfather's handwriting is almost the same as my father's. They have the same handwriting, so it's quite difficult to distinguish both. And so it's also very particular kind of a thing, It's
very difficult to distinguish you from your grandfather, by the way. And hope we're gonna be able to show some of the photographs of your grandfather, and you really are a striking image of him as well. And I think it's great that this is a continuum and a way of work that you do is bringing to life both the films of your father and the poetry of your grandfather. And I just want to add, as a Russian speaker, for English speaker, maybe it isn't as poems of your grandfather may not be as popular as known, but to Russian literature, his work is considered to be on the level of some of the greatest poets, and certainly one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, and of course into today. And I think it's important to note. Has your grandfather received any recognition in the time of the Soviet period, or even later after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, he was quite unfortunate because somehow artistically and poetically, African his poetic language, he belongs to the Silver Age. People he knew like Pasternak, Tsvetaeva, and Akhmatova, who actually liked a lot my grandfather's poems, and they have a great friendship with Tsvetaeva, my grandfather, and her. And she dedicated a few poems to him, and he dedicated her. And but he was a younger poet. So when he started to wanted to publish his first book, I think it was around late 30s, was about to be published. It was already put into the printing machine, but then censorship said no. He was criticized for being too poetic, too religious, too spiritual. So the book was destroyed, and actually the first book was published when he was in his 50s. So it was, I think, 1962. Перед снегом, before the snow. So he had to leave, of course. He had to so he became very famous with his translations. He lived by translating a lot of poetry from especially Caucasus and Asia and Arabic languages. He spoke 6 languages. So actually,
wow, I didn't know that.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes, from Rumi to Armenian, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, epos, poems, poetry, and he's very famous. He received a lot of recognition actually from those countries.
Are his poems translated into English in some recommendable form?
Well, actually, I think there is only one book I've seen. I don't remember who did the translation. Unfortunately, they're not much. He's not very much translated. And I remember that my father tried to make this translation into Italian. When he came to Italy in 1982, he asked, and he made Bertolucci, who's the father, was a great poet, Attilio Bertolucci, and he asked him to translate his father's poems. And actually they agreed, but then Bertolucci died, and it didn't come out. But the problem of the translation, it's quite complicated. I don't know. You remember the dialogue about the translation in Nostalgia, when Gorchakov, the hero, was saying that it's impossible to translate the poetry. It's kind of, it can get closer as much as possible.
Well, would you say that actually the films of your father are a form of translation then of the poetry of your grandfather?
Well, I think language? So. We can say that, but I think that cinema, it's not. It's quite a direct, it's a different form of art. It's not using anything. There no. It's not a translation. It's a direct action on the spectator, on the audience. So in cinema, you don't need to translate. So that's actually something that I think my father understood and liked a lot in the cinema. That's actually, I think, why his films are so well received all around the world, because it goes directly. There's no translation. It goes directly, acts directly on your emotional level, on any human beings. We are different, but not that different. We are all human beings who have our soul. So it goes into, and we react all the same way. So, and instead in literature, of course, the language is, of course, it's already the first border that we have to cross. And but still, there are very good translations of the poems, and maybe we will never know. Dante, for example, we love it all around the world, if even don't speak Italian. But of course, maybe Italians understand Dante much better, or in some different way that, like maybe Russians understand Pushkin in our own way.
Well, speaking of Dante, you are currently speaking to us from his hometown, from Great Florence, where you ended up very early on in your life as a teenager, we understand, and you, with your father being invited to Florence and living there. You're currently living in Florence, and you obviously do speak Italian language fluently. And you also speak great English. I wanted to ask you, where did you learn English?
Oh well, I learned. I began studying in Russia, of course, because it's something that I had to do before I got into the West, Europe. Although then I was for a couple of years in American school here in Florence as well to make my degrees to be able to go to the university here. So I have a lot of friends and contacts and readings, of course. So that's how it happened. Because of course, when I left Soviet Union, I always only speak some English, so I had to go to American school just to finish my studies and to get Italian came afterwards in parallel to my studies.
Did your father love Florence?
A lot. Yes. Well, it was something special. As you know, my father was a great admirer of the Renaissance painters, Piero della Francesca, Leonardo, his favorite, and Italy, and somehow Florence, the city of the Renaissance, was very important to him. And he, like for any Russian, maybe Russians like in the 19th century who travels to travel to Florence to see the city, they see this. They actually were looking for this kind of a spiritual renaissance as well, and Florence reminded them about that. So for my father, this was a very important city. Actually, he wanted to live here, and he wanted to create an academy, Florence, an academy of cinema, but not only. Academy dedicated to art studies, when he wanted to teach his view, his ideas about art. So that's why actually my choice was to keep everything here in Florence, to reunite all the archives that were around the world, from Russia, from Paris, and that's why actually we worked from Florence.
Well, that's great. It was great to see you in Florence, Andrei, and I just had a meeting and another interview recorded actually in the Academy of Classical Art, Florence Classical Art Academy, that has been active in Florence since 2009. And we were talking about how this could have been a continuation of your father's dream, and it's still manifested in a way. We don't have cinema department there just for now, but it's a plural classical arts name will hopefully eventually lend room for cinema direction in this classical format, and it's also great to know that your father was also trained as an artist, as a classical artist in a Russian academic tradition, and partially as a musician and academic piano, I believe. But could you speak a little bit about his artistic background as a foundation and appreciation for this culture?
Yes, he studied when he was a child, a kid. He studied piano and music school, and painting, the painting school, of course. In my film, you can see some of his paintings. Well, actually, quite impressionist, some kind of contemporary view, very particular. And but then, actually, when he started to make films, he abandoned. He was quite very precise in his ideas. He said, if I'm doing this film director, I have to do cinema. I'm not a musician. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an artist. I'm doing that. So he believed that he had to dedicate himself totally to his work without any distractions like musical paintings or other.
Well, coming back to the to the word on poetry, it struck me when he mentioned, and when he spoke to your grandfather said, Arseny said that, I actually don't think you're making films, which made Andrei very happy. So in a way, what do you think was meant by that? Was it poems, or was it art with a capital A, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think so. He believed that Arseny understood that he was translating poetry, poetic language. It was a new kind of a poetic language that his father understood. Arseny understood because he was a poet, so he actually understood what he was trying to do in the cinema, what he was trying to achieve. So it's, of course, it's much closer to poetry than
I have a question on that point. Why cinema and not just become a poet?
Well, I think that being a poet after my grandfather, it was very complicated. You know, my father was a very strong personality, so he had to fight already all his life and to confront himself with my grandfather, as always we do. You know, there's always a great figure of someone behind our back, and that we have to get free of, but still still have a great influence. And Arseny Tarkovsky was really and is one of the greatest Russian poets of 20th century. It's true, and he didn't want to just be in a second one or and then he finally found this in the film school his way to speak and make poetry, but in a different way. It took him quite a while. Actually, after school, he went to the school of Arabic languages, so it's, Oriental studies, and he was there for a couple of years, but he didn't like it. So, and then he went for 1 year working in Siberia, just in the middle of nowhere on the river, on an expedition. They were looking for gold, from the government. And he was a simple helper worker. So this actually experience living in the woods for a year for a boy who was, I think, 19 years old, 20 years old, was quite formative for him. So when he come back to Moscow, he went directly to the film school. He understood that there was something there that he was searching for. Although he said that only after Ivan's childhood he understood how it worked, how the cinema worked, and what he wanted to really to do. But I believe that since his first work, since his first diploma, actually he made in the 1960s, the steamroller and the violin, there are already some kind of this ideas that goes throughout all his films. By the way, actually, in the 60s, I think 61, he came to New York in America because he won a first prize as the student film at the Student Film Festival. That was for him also an first experience of going abroad in Russia. Yeah.
What was his impression of New York and America?
He didn't talk much.
First impression, I guess.
Yes, he was there, and also I think with Ivan's childhood, but I don't know. He didn't talk much about it, but I find in our archives the menu from the Russian Tea Room in New York, and it was signed to Andrei Tarkovsky from Igor Stravinsky. Actually, they met there in the Russian Tea Room, so all of it was kind of amazing. Yes, I think he enjoyed it very much.
It's one of the greatest Russian composers of the 20th century.
Yes,
Stravinsky, and I understand your father was also good friends with Rostropovich, Mstislav Rostropovich, also, probably one of the greatest cello players and conductors and classical musicians of the plethora of who performed Shostakovich symphonies, was first to perform them. And just to give our viewers a reference to that sort of level of cultural connections that were happening in your father's life, but also in music. And again, another quote I remember by a father who says, "Well, it would be funny to call Bach a great composer, as it would be funny to call Leonardo a great artist." He's saying they're all poets in his understanding. So it's kind of bring it back to the perception of poetry as something. As a man of the cloth, I would say, are they all talking about really the the word as a presence of God manifest in this world, and poetry maybe is the closest thing to reflect that.
I think so. Yes, he in his last year he was talking a lot about that, and it's actually he quoted that in his last chapter of Sculpting in Time, when he compares a poet to a prophet. You remember the famous poem by Pushkin, Prorok, which actually he quotes quite a few times, and he believed that, yes, the poet is someone that sacrifices everything for the truth, for search for the truth, for the meaning of life. And that was his idea actually about art. Art was meaning of knowledge, of knowing where we're going, where we're from, and searching for God, searching for answers. And that's why cinema or art wasn't actually the point of arrival, but just the beginning of his own way of searching things, his own search, and which was much more important for him rather than his films. You know, his films were the meanings of knowing. It was just passages on his life, of his spiritual search somehow.
That seems to be God's view as well, because so much of Scripture, so many of the messianic prophecies in Isaiah, David's Psalms, they're essentially poetic, and in the Orthodox tradition of hymns and hymnography and iconography, the written the symbols are reality, right? The icons are a written text, just like the scriptures are a written text. And so in that sense, I think that makes perfect sense, that poetry has this sort of transcendent ability to speak on multiple levels about reality existing in multiple levels.
Exactly. Yes, and that's actually, I think, was something that he understood and he was working on since the beginning, because if we see, for example, Andrei Rublev, which actually speaks about the icon painter, the medieval icon painter. And this actually was his ideas of this life of this monk who went through all the hell of life, and the violence and the problems of the medieval Russia. And nonetheless, he created his masterpieces. Actually, at the end, he started to create after going through all this of this purgatory of life. So, and this idea actually, and he was only 30 when he started to work on the film, so he was very young. So I think that he's artistically and philosophically, his ideas were already formed. He was formed as a person, as an artist, as a human being. So that's actually something he and once you're formed, you can only, enrich your personality, but your core is there. And that's why actually I think all his films, we can talk about now a lot of different aspects, but we also can say that every film of Tarkovsky is the same film. It's like a same movie going from one to another, which evolving from one idea, one subject to another subject.
I just wanted to mention that Andrei, as I was really excited meeting in Florence, I found out that Andrei is currently working on the digital remastered uncut version of Andrei Rublev. Before we move on to Jay's question.
Yes, of course. Yes, actually, Andrei Rublev was the only film that my father released which was censored. So there were quite a lot of cuts from censorship. The film actually was shot in 1966 and came out in 1972 on the screens, and the film risked to be washed out. So that means destroyed and dissolved in the accident, as they used to do with the films or that were not allowed public. And so my father fought a lot for this film, tried to show it as much as possible. Unfortunately, in 1969, the film was actually brought illegally to Paris, to Cannes Film Festival by Jack Lang, that was the Minister of Culture. He loved the film, and they brought the film to Paris, and they showed it of in competition, out of competition, because the Soviets said no, but they couldn't say no for the projection, and they discovered this masterpiece, so actually they couldn't destroy it anymore. But they were actually, and they were, but the authorities, the censors were constantly forcing my father to cut. So actually, from 205 minutes of the first edited version of the film, we arrived to 180 minutes, 81 minutes of official released version that we know. But the author version, of course, the first cut is when you see the first film in your life or in your work, and then you start to work on it to cut it. So actually, with the cast he was obliged to do, he also edited film as he liked to. So the director's cut version, which actually we're doing, is somewhere in between the long version, the first one, and the last one. And the work consists actually in evaluating which cuts were made for the censorship and which were made actually by my father. So fortunately, we almost finished, and now the restoration of the image is going on. And I think the deadline at the end of the year, December.
Wow, very exciting. And now as you're speaking about the story of the reels, as they would subject them to this acid wash to erase them, which this is the first time I hear this.
How you destroy work of art as film. It's a very actually violent form. You put, you dissolve the film in acid, and it's only the plastic film remains. Nothing. Everything.
So the images removed in this way. It can't help it but bring to the same association what the Soviet regime or Bolsheviks at the time of revolution would do to icons, as they would remove them from churches, burn them.
The form of iconoclasm.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's actually what we are finishing. So the film, the original director's cut, will be somewhere around 191 minutes, so 10 minutes more of images from.
So one thing that struck me watching the documentary and the clips that you had early on, there was a statement where he said, Jean-Paul Sartre had given a review of the film. He said, it didn't do me any good, though, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm an artist. And then I noticed that, as the films progress, they seem to get very philosophical. So I'm just curious about this seeming contradiction in that, on the one hand, is it something that he grew to be more interested in philosophy, or were the films always philosophical, but he didn't feel that was really what he was speaking, the language of philosophy? It's just odd to me that he would say that, but then, there's so much philosophical questioning and sort of ruminations and struggling going on throughout the films.
Yes, I think of course he believed of himself to be an artist, and he was an artist, first of all, a poet. But as all the great artists, all the great masterpieces, has an incredible philosophical content. It's something that goes both one with other. He wasn't a philosopher in his approach to work of art, to life, but of course his intuitions, and great intuition. And as I said before, he believed that art is just another form of knowledge, as philosophy, as science, or other forms of evolution, of knowing, the human race. And I think that's his work, his art is have a precise philosophical meaning. We can say that this actually expresses few very concrete philosophical ideas, but by means of the images, by means of his films. And but as many other artists did in painting and poetry, and we were talking about Dante before, and of course Dante is one of the greatest philosophers of the medieval age. He's the father of Italian and European culture. But he was a poet, and he believed himself as a poet, of course, in the first place. but he never put philosophy before. He didn't believe to be conceptual in art. He was against that kind of approach, because he believed that a concept, an idea, and a symbol destroys everything, destroys the magic of an image. Because once you discover the symbol, as he says, it's over. You find out an answer, but it's limited. But he was trying to create an image of the universe, which is unlimited. It's unlimited the ways of interpretation. So for him, the most important approach to his work was that of a child, as he said also in the film, remember. And he says that child is very inexperienced, but at the same time open mind to approach. He believes what he's shown. So he said, to see my films, you can see it. You must see it through the eyes of a child, with the eyes of a child, first of all. Then, of course, philosophical or intellectual analysis comes afterwards. But the most important is emotional contact you establish with the author, and that's actually the very important thing. And once this contact is established, you feel, and the same emotion the author was putting into the work of art. And that's actually the idea of compassion. To be compassionate, I mean to feel the same way. It's actually a very anti-Greek idea of catharsis, and and it's also very religious as well, because that's here maybe comes the idea of his. He said, "My films are a prayer," so it's offering. It's an offering that can, if someone agrees with me, with my ideas, and can feel my pain, my search, my urge, and it can become a prayer for someone else. That means that my film is appreciated. So that's I think what was the most important thing for him. But although behind all that, there is a lot of studies and a lot of course, philosophical content.
Is this an attempt to sort of grasp at or make the statement that, in the Western Latin tradition of Roman Catholicism or something like this, you get this overly scholastic intellectual approach, and that perhaps that the Orthodox tradition in the East, in Russia and so forth, had never really undergone that extreme rationalist approach. And so in Orthodox theology, there was always this, and in the culture as well, because I know he says something to the effect that you can't really separate culture and religion. They kind of go together. There's always this appreciation of the mysterious. The divine liturgy is a mystery. The sacraments are mysteries. And so art is not primarily something that is attempting to rationalize and conceptualize. It's attempting to give a kind of existential, direct, intuitive experience. Is that really what's being said?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely, you're right. So that was very important for him. Yes, for here in the West, especially, we don't know very well what was how the Russian philosophy actually was also developing, and we spoke before, about Florensky, we spoke about Berdiaev, this religious philosophy, which is very particular, which we couldn't, because with the revolution, of course, that was abruptly stopped. The tradition was stopped. Some of them were died, some were killed, some of them immigrated. So. And in the schools and universities in Europe, we don't study this kind. Now it's good to start to come out. What was the ideas? What was this approach? Eastern approach to philosophy. The idea of the mystery of religion. It's very important, I think, to understand. Actually, well, at a certain point, the father of this was Dostoevsky, which was my father's favorite, I think, writer. Although he was speaking about Tolstoy as the perfect example of the great artist, but Dostoevsky was a man that was suffering, quarreling. It's something that also was very interesting to him. He always wanted to make a film about Dostoevsky. He never managed to. He wrote a lot about Dostoevsky and his works, and a lot of ideas for the scripts. But then, if you see carefully his films, I think there are Dostoevsky in every movie. You can even quote sometimes something about that. So that's actually, as we speaking about these roots, the connections that he, my father, strongly believed, because there's also sometimes the film critics get wrong, because he was always, against the film critics, as you've seen from the movie. They didn't understand anything because the critics didn't understand this connection. He always believed that an artist can grow out of nowhere. He had to be independent, but of course his roots are profoundly Russian. It's his education profoundly Russian. So that's something that we should understand. And every great artist has this connection to his land, to their genetic and artistic pool that actually. He believed that an artist somehow is, he used to say in his diaries that the artist is just a product of this, that comes out like a diamond from all this great pool of coal of the people of his nation, of a nation that, and that's actually, and his duty is to serve, because of course talent and his gift was given to him by someone, but you have to serve it. You cannot actually gain anything from it. It's a burden. It's not something that you have to be happy about, but you have to serve it.
Well, to me, of course, as a priest, the idea of service has resonated very deeply in the words of Andrei Tarkovsky when he actually says in the film that to him service is the only true form of human relationship, or I guess approach to life that is the most direct and honest, is to serve. And I think, in that sense, he's, it's a broad statement. Of course, it can be even reduced to a theological simplicity of Adam being the first servant of God, the first priest, the first one to serve. Then we initially see this whole drama unfold into the split about with Cain and Abel being again in service to God, and then that service being somehow then clearly taking different directions with different results. And then he points out this contrast of service versus powers that be, that actually exist on a different plane, where they're actually not serving. They're attempting to control and make things serve their interests versus a true intention for a human being to be that servant of God in the most liberating sense. That's kind of what I was getting and wanted to point it out as you mentioned this idea of service to art. And would you say that your father saw that as a service to God as well?
I think so. He was a very spiritual person. He wasn't, very orthodox in his way of thinking, because, he quotes a lot. I think he was also somehow was looking for kind of a synthesis of spiritual results. But in this, he's very Russian still, and his roots are very Russian and Orthodox, I think. I believe that. And this idea of service, of course, and he actually, his life was somehow demonstrates that he sacrificed everything for this film. He never accepted any compromises for his films. He could have been quite well man with well respected in Soviet Union. He would make some movies that, popular movies or something that would keep him well with money and respect from Soviet authority, but he never did that, actually.
So you say everything. Is it a form of martyrdom in a sense of martyr, of course, in Greek, is a witness. He's a witness to the truth at the cost of his own comforts and even safety and even life, as we can see as his story of his life propels to this very dramatic events. Maybe, if you will, you could share a little bit with us the that difficult period, that basically his uncompromising faith and dedication to art, and which, by the way, is definitely deeply reflects Orthodox Russian culture and holy ideals of that there are present in our faith, that he tried to live out in his format of work. But would you share how this sort of, how it led to his, as some people I think wrongly call it defection? Like he didn't really ran from Russia. He did everything to remain there, and we do see that in the film, in your film, more in a chapter that's dedicated to home and house and his life, and what he put into being connected to his land and his country. But could you speak a little bit more about the leaving and the tragedy of that and the drama of that? That's real life story drama.
Of course. Well, he was a man of principles, and this actually was kind of a person who, if he knows that someone is not an honest man, he will never gave him a hand. He was that kind of person, and actually, he never hid anything. So he always said the truth right directly to the person. So you understand that in our society, modern society, or in Soviet society, that wasn't very well accepted, and of course the quarreling with the regime, of course, with the censorship, that was something that we all get used to in Soviet Union, as you know. It was every day, it was something that you have to deal with. But the thing that hurt most was the disrespect and envy of his colleagues, because not everyone can be that kind of directly and free in his expressions. Someone were trying to make their living and being, diplomatic with the powers, and as always, and that actually created a lot of enemies in his life, of course, and enemies that were especially in his field, between his colleagues. So but he always fought. He never, of course, it took him 5 years more or less for every film to come out, but he believed that he can do it, he can work it. And actually, when he came in Italy, he didn't have the idea to remain here. He was shooting Nostalgia. It was a Soviet Italian co-production, so he was intended to return and to try to go on and to find other ways for his projects. Although when the film was actually in Cannes, or in Venice, no, in Cannes, sorry, and it was so violently blocked and by Soviets, and he understood that actually that's it, that's the end. So if I go back, I won't never make any movie anymore. And for him, it was like death. It was what he can do, if an artist can do. He always said, a painter, of course, if you're not drawing, you can paint anyway. You can paint at home, but film director, his art, he couldn't perform his art. So that was actually the point that made him make this decision, actually a catastrophic decision for him, for his life, for his. And the idea of abandoning home, as he said in his film. Well, at the end, he never had a home anymore. When in Sacrifice, the hero Alexander burns the house, burns the home, and that's actually was a little bit the idea of him. It's a little bit. It's prophetic, actually, in his life. He never had a home anymore. Never had a land. He always wanted to make to buy a house, to build a house, but he never managed to. He never managed this. It actually was a drama of his life, and the home was very important because that country house that he bought with my mother was some place that he adored and where he worked, and it was some kind of a spiritual retirement for him there. And once he couldn't visit it anymore, once he couldn't go there anymore, was for him quite a shock as well. And of course, being detached, as he says in the film, you remember this tragic words about not be able to work for his public, or Russian public that loved his film, for who he was actually working. And that was very dramatic. Although he believed that even someone asked him once whether he can, how he will work now in the West without contact, without his culture, without language. And he said, I will do the same thing that I always did, and it doesn't matter where. But I mean, of course, it would be more difficult maybe, but I would keep on with my ideas in my films, and I will adopt myself. There's no problem. So he made the nostalgia and sacrifice abroad, and he could have been working for a long time after. Although that's actually, I think that drama of separation was the thing that triggered somehow his illness and his departure.
And that was also all kind of happening at the time when, the initial, your father and your mother, as I understand, staying after that clear war proclamation to his work and his career that was made in Cannes. They chose to stay, and you and your grandma remained in Russia, and you were separated for quite some time. And that, of course, was a tragedy that went through your family and your personal life, of course, and of course, it was a dramatic period because nobody knew what could happen to you if you would be ever allowed to see each other. We see that in the film. We see some very touching footage of you meeting your mother at the airport after a few years of separation. Could you speak a little bit more about that period?
Yeah, that was the most difficult period, of course. I was 11 when he left. We met, I was 15. So this 4 years for a boy that age was quite complicated without parents. And of course, for him, it was terrible. For them, for my mother, for him. We spoke a lot on the phone, and we tried to keep in contact, but still the separation. And, we never knew that... will we meet or will we not meet? I had faith that one day we'll meet. I was sure about it, and that will actually help me to go through all this. I was sure. I don't know. No matter how long it will take, 1 year, 10 years, but we will meet, and that was actually my safe ground somehow. That helped me to get through. I don't know, for him it was also, of course, much more difficult. And but in the end, they let me go only when they get to know that he had cancer. It's also, I was a hostage. Once he got sick and he was dying, hostages no more. Doesn't matter anymore, so they let me go. And of course, it was the beginning of Gorbachev's era, and Mitterrand wrote a telegram to Gorbachev to let us go, me and my grandma. So that's actually played a role in this story. But I think also that they get to know that he was sick. He was mortally sick. So okay, that's it. That's over.
So that joy of reunion quickly.
Yeah, the joy of union was, of course, it was actually, fortunately we had this year together just to catch up and a little bit. But of course, we're living from one anglass to another,
under the shadow of death in some way.
Yeah, the shadow of death, and that was actually very difficult times. But I'm grateful that at least we met. Could be
yes, and I noted that in a documentary, your father speaks a lot about battle with death in his art, as his art being an affirmation of life, and any form of art is in a way being a image and likeness a creator, as an imitation, as he calls it, of God in a good sense, is an affirmation of life and a battle with death. So it is in a way a very paschal, very if you could say, would you say his works are an icon of resurrection in film in some way?
Somehow, I think that, well, he was very strong, and to say these things, when you're well and just affirming it is one thing. To say those things that he's saying about life and death and not being afraid of death while you're already dying, it's a different thing. And that's actually the phrase in the movie. It was from his last interviews. It's from 1986. He was already sick, and he was.
Oh,
I think he believed that. He knew that he was going to die. So that actually shows his great faith. I think it's something that not easy for anyone to say, but when you are close to death, it's something special. It gives you a little bit the idea of his strength, this kind of belief he has, and of course his films, and somehow, being for him was kind of a prophetical, because his story of Gorchakov and Nostalgia, the hero who never goes back to Russia, he dies actually.
Right.
And this Sacrifice, the first draft of the screenplay, was written about the hero who was getting sick, who was getting a cancer, and then he got he was meeting the witch that actually helped him. This lady, this weird, strange lady that helped him to survive. So he said at the end, I remember last year he was saying, I have to stop to making movies which so prophetic was about myself. I have to start to do something about totally different, because everything that I do in my films are actually becoming true for me, for my life, for my existence. And he was joking, but well, it's actually true. So, but somehow, I think that I don't know how, as a great artist, they have this feeling, they have this vision which goes much beyond ours, and he can sense things, he can see things that we are not able to, and of course this incredible belief that he has in that. It's another thing that I think that characterizes him very well. So also he says a lot about this, the idea of freedom, which actually helped him to get through. And this freedom and sacrifice and freedom, apparently it's a thing that doesn't correspond, but it's actually the same thing. He said that in a country with a strong regime, I met a lot of people who are extremely free, and in the Western world, there are a lot of people who are not free. And this actually was one of the idea, not the idea, it was him, because he was someone, the first impression you had when you was meeting him, it's to see someone completely, free. Someone was, he was walking on the street and people were looking at him because he was he was different. He was different because he didn't feel himself constrained from any kind of thing. So I think it's also they gave him this great faith that was giving him this strength, this appeal, and so I think he wasn't saying that much. He wasn't showing much his religiousness. He was very quiet. He was always saying that you have to believe quietly. It was very personal for him. He never actually asked or insisted for anyone to make a certain readings or to go to church or however. But for him, it was very intense spiritual, intense life within him, his soul. So that's actually the last period, the last months of his life was. What he writes in his diaries, the last project was concerning the Golgotha. And, he was reflecting, was thinking about the Judas kiss, and why Judas betrays Jesus, and how it all develops, how it's and what actually was supposed to be his next movie, the passions and the relationship between Judah and Christ. So
Really?
that's yeah.
Wow. And what was it? Something he was writing as a script, or is he going to use any?
No, he was writing in his diary, in his martyrologue. It's the last notes from his writings. He was thinking a lot.
Martyrologue has the same root as the martyr, but again, of course, is a testament of his life as a witness of events and his personal inner attitude towards things. And as you're speaking, I see one of the quotes I jotted down from the film that struck me very deeply. I think it's a condensation of a lot of things that we're seeing. As he says that art is one of the most selfless acts for a human being. That art is a prayer, and that. If I pray that way, and if that prayer is heard by others as well, then it was successful. So his supplication, his form of offering, was ultimately a prayer to God, and his films would you say, were definitely that?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. I think it was his sacrifice, it was his offering, as we can say. It's because sacrifice, actually, yes, it's a title of the film, but the meaning is offering, because actually in Swedish it's called offret. Because in Swedish sacrifice is offret, and so it's linguistically a little bit different as. It's less pagan as the idea, but more spiritually. Offer it is something we offer, something to give, wishing to give. So that was actually his idea.
Well, your father, as you're describing, had a very uncompromising spirit, in a good sense. And indeed, his offerings were, coming back to Cain and Abel, idea that the perfect offering is the offering that is complete, that leaves nothing to myself. Interestingly, in the biblical format, that word that's used for the description of the offering of Abel to God is the same word used as the word when Abraham is offering Isaac to God, as again an image of a coming Son of God who will be offered. That essence of full offering, where nothing is held back, is in a way was the way of life for Tarkovsky, is what I'm trying to see here. It was truly an attachment. He did not compromise, as you said, and that's where he says art is the most selfless form. He's not even considering anything that's selfish to be art, because it's not a pure offering. It's something for me, something for you, something for them, and we're living in the world, as he pointed out quite some time ago, constantly, that we're living in the world of spiritual crisis. We were living in the world of spiritual crisis when he was alive, and his work seemed to be this wake-up call in its essence, not by intention, not by just idea that he wanted to bring forth, but by all of it in totality. That's kind of what I'm seeing as an offering, as you mentioned in the name of the film, which I didn't realize in Swedish, that had that quality. Just kind of all comes together in that sense for me. Thank you. Just wanted to point that out, and maybe Jay can also join us on his theology ideas and other things as well.
Yeah, well, my next question was going to be about the juxtaposition, the contrast between throughout the films. There's a lot of desolate landscapes. There's a lot of obviously Stalker is post-apocalyptic. We have those same kinds of apocalypse themes, in the film, the last film there that you're talking about, Sacrifice. So my question is, to what degree do you think that, and I don't mean this because you mentioned yourself multiple times, the prophetic elements, and you've noted that there was kind of a prophetic element to a lot of the films that related to his own life personally. Is there another perhaps prophetic element to, in the sense that he was perhaps warning where we might be going? If there's, are we perhaps in an end of days period? Could we be at this apocalyptic scenario? Is that because he was situated in the Cold War? Or is there more to it? Like, is there this foreboding sense, like we have in Stalker, that, Stalker continually references the apocalypse in the documentary? Your father is kind of giving a talk, and he keeps talking about how the apocalypse is so relevant as the greatest work of poetry. And I guess what I'm asking is, how do you think he was interpreting this notion of apocalypse and the end and the Book of Revelations and so forth throughout these films? Was it just something personal, or do you think he was speaking to a broader global concern? And was that just because of the Cold War, or is that perhaps extending beyond the Cold War? Because some people talk about, did this predict Chernobyl? Is there a prophetic element here? And I wouldn't be surprised, because Dostoevsky had so many prophetic elements throughout his novels. The Grand Inquisitor has these prophetic elements about the papacy. Demons has this prophetic element of the Bolsheviks years before the Bolsheviks, kill millions of people. Is there a prophetic element here? I guess I'm rambling, but that's essentially what I'm asking.
Well, I think they are, but I don't think it concerns the immediate history. It's just, I think, the sense of danger that he felt as an artist, as a person who was so sensitive to the reality, that he believed that our civilization is taking totally wrong direction, that science goes too much further, and we are spiritually, we remain at the same point that we were 2,000 years ago, and that actually would bring the crisis. It will bring more and more catastrophes to our lives, because until we will not solve our this question, the question of until we not grow ourselves spiritually into someone else, the civilization there will be always wars, there will be always catastrophe, there will be always conflicts. And as he says it, I think it's beautiful. And he said that the most dangerous thing is that when we are not fighting the evil within ourselves, we're fighting the evil within the others. So we're trying to direct into the other people without knowing that we are imperfect. So there's no personal involvement into that. We delegate everything to politicians. We delegate everything to the state. We delegate we're not participating actually, and we're not somewhat even interested into that. And he said that actually will bring a lot of catastrophe. That he speaks in 1983 about the ecological crisis, which we're actually facing now with much more intensity than it was before. And that maybe that 83 that was just words, but now it's quite it's a serious argument. And
is there a warning about going too too far with technology, with what's sometimes called technocracy or transhumanism, to use the phrase of the Huxleys, that man, in his quest for, Faustian level knowledge of science and tech, that this could actually be the undoing. Is that a warning present here?
I think so. I think that the idea is that man is not ready morally, from his moral point of view, to certain discoveries. We discovered the nuclear energy. We made it's immediately a bomb. We discover, biology. It's immediately the bioweapons that goes around. And in that, all the discoveries, much more, all of the discoveries in science are mostly comes from the discoveries for the military research. And so that's actually something that he was scared. And it's not only the problem of his period, the Soviets, and I think it's actually the most important question for him was our lack of spiritual knowledge of ourselves. If we evolve spiritually, it wouldn't be happened. The idea of people killing each other is something that for now is quite well accepted. But I think from spiritual point of view, just the idea of killing another human being is awful. And it brings to catastrophe. So it's something that we have to keep in mind. And I think that was his idea. And we were speaking about the nature. Yes. Yeah, in the first films, the nature is somehow, as we remember, Solaris and Andrei Rublev, that there is a fantastic relationship of human being with the nature. This the returning to always like a mirror of something beautiful that we are losing. But we still have to touch. We can still touch and contact. But in later films like Stalker, for example, Nostalgia, the nature is much more distant. It's already somehow, it's like we're seeing the last train lights, the train that's already departed. So there's maybe something more desperation in his idea and vision of the things, because with his experience, with his life, he was seeing that the world was going somewhere. And yeah, there's coincidence, I don't know, with this Chernobyl and Stalker, but it's just something that will happen. And once the bomb was invented, it's already one day it will click. We're producing so much arms and munitions, so one day they will explode, and they will, as we all now are witnessing today. So there's something that was worrying him. That was, I think, his main concern.
Well, when you spoke earlier about his experience as a young man, 19-year-old, very formative experience of 1 year being in the wilderness, it definitely clearly now to me explains a little bit of or a lot of the impact that it had on his being and his connection to nature that was formed as almost grown into, rooted in experience of the Russian North wildlife experience. Like for Americans, it may be something like Alaska or Canada equivalent. And we understand that life in that environment connects you to something very, very deep and spiritual, in a sense that he is taking, that Andrei Tarkovsky is taking into his films, which we must note that isn't quite the practice of the time in cinematography, or at least in the Soviet cinematography, or in cinematography of entertainment per se, of the West. Nature isn't brought to such a high level of contemplation and relationship to it seems to be definitely shown throughout the films. As we go, and I hope we do continue our anthology, we talk about each film with much more detail, but we can see how nature and Stalker is shown in its very, very damaged form, and as a result of this apocalyptic event that have taken place. But then as you brought it to sacrifice, it just kind of dawned on me that at the very last scene, at the very last scene of all his films where we see that tree, we see that dead tree, that the little boy who is you, as a matter of fact, right, is watering. And I think that it sends a very, very beautiful message of hope. And the story is told that the watering of that tree is something that seems to be hopeless and pointless. And yet, from the story that he tells about this monk living in an Orthodox monastery, who was watering this dead tree, and one day that tree has flowered and bore leaves. And I think that last statement, to me at least, it speaks about the element of faith and irrationality of faith, and the dedication and the act of God that happens beyond what we do. We do have to do it, but even if it makes no sense anymore. And I think that message to me is very powerful and very profoundly faith based.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was his all his films apparently, which deals with quite a dramatic events, a terrible. There's always hope. It always finishes with a great idea of hope. It's never negative. I don't know. Ishii gives changes. He changes as a spectator, changes us every time we see it, and it gives another angle, another view of reality. It gives, at least to me, it gives hope. Nonetheless, in a hopeless situation as it is. So I think it's very important. And the idea, the nature, of course, for him felt fundamental. I think, so that this trip to Siberia, this working with the simple people, working sometimes weeks being alone in the woods, and just with a rifle and a pair of shoes, that was for him a very, very strong experience. And by the way, when we were talking to American audience, one of his favorite books, and he was keep on reading it many times, it was always next to him, was Walden, Thoreau, Life in the Woods. And he always said to me, you have to read this book, it's very important. And so that's when he speaks about the freedom and about the society, how we build it, how we actually corrupted by the society, how we are not free of it. And we don't need much in our life. We need just the nature around. We can survive anyhow. So there are a lot of, I think, points that we can later discuss when we talk about each film in particular. But I think this somehow reassumes his vision, his idea.
I know this is cheating, but I have to go ahead and ask because it's been bothering me for a long time. But so I know we'll get to it when we get to the specific films. But can you tell me, so that I have a new way to look at the films, I guess, perhaps if you clarify this for me, what your reading of it is. When we see the levitation and the telekinesis, what I thought of was, well, is this the notion that humans have, after this great catastrophe that occurs, whatever it might be, is this something that occurs as a part of just sort of evolution, a man evolving to the next stage? Or is this a reference to something like in Orthodoxy, a theosis of man being divinized? What is the significance of these kinds of scenes in the films?
Well, we can think about it as a part of the film, because of course, because the story, the script says that she's a mutant, and this girl has special powers, and although we also there could be the idea that, of course, that our evolution is not over. The human beings, and we're not perfect, but we can evolve. We can do amazing things, and this is one of those things that maybe a human being is capable of. It could be capable of, and like flying, like levitating, But this is more about the dream, it's in the mirror and sacrifice and Solaris. Yes, I think I think that's actually part of his interest, his research into our evolution and evolution of human spirit, evolution of human beings, which can give us much more, and we can discover much more that we know for now, because he was very curious about it. So that's something that was what was in his interest. He was curious about human capabilities and what we can do, what we can achieve with our spiritual strength, and maybe, and this is maybe resulted in the films some kind of a hints of this, of his ideas. Could be, may not.
That notion of the tree. This is a stretch, but I know you said there was a fascination with Thoreau, but the tree that dies and gets watered, this is very prevalent in Tolkien, all throughout Tolkien's works as well, both the older stories and Lord of the Rings. Was there any interest in Tolkien in that regard? I know he's very, very Western, very British, but it's a recurring theme.
No, actually, that story comes from the book, from the Lives of Fathers of the Church. And it's actually the story of this two monks, and the one monk asked the other to water this tree, and the tree, and he waters the tree, and for years, and then at the end the tree blossoms, and it gives a fruit. And the couple takes this fruit, brings to his master, and they cut the fruit. They said, "Eat it," and this is the fruit of obedience. So also the idea of sacrifice. So it's very religious and
right. It's a monastic story, right?
It's a monastic story.
Right.
Yeah.
Did your father? Well, I should have rephrased that question. Did your father have any interest in the mythological tradition of the West that Tolkien tries to encapsulate? I know you had said that he had a fascination with science. He liked science fiction, right? Did he enjoy any of the mythological traditions of the West?
Well, he likes the myths. Actually, he read a lot of mythology. They studied on mythology, and but more from this from really scientific point of view, mythology from all over the world. He has a lot of books dedicated to that. But I don't think he never read Tolkien, because he never translated. And but it's more about I think it was more about the spiritual way, the monastic ways he was searching for, especially for Sacrifice, which is actually his last film testament. Maybe he felt that it could be his last movie. So and I should say that the last year of when actually we met after 4 years, I found him very more religious, very more concentrated on faith, on the questions of faith and Christian. Of course, he was thinking about death. He was dying, but still he was very very concerned about especially specific religious questions on this film. So it's of course interested in science fiction. He was interested in science fiction as far, I think it gave him possibility to make two films in Soviet Union. Speaking of something else, by using other means, like Solaris, and Stalker. It's scientific, of course, science fiction, but it's not a science fiction. It's nothing closer to science fiction. Just the story, the idea, the plot. And so that actually was his way to find a possibility to make a movie with the censorship. Science fiction was giving in that time in Soviet Union possibility to say something more. Because
I see, right. So because the Soviet
to avoid, so bypass the
right.
censorship somehow. So that's actually that's why he was so researching the ideas in science fiction. But his readings were, as I said, Dostoevsky, Russian classics. But even Germans, he has a lot of there's a project on Hoffman, which is actually also he's quite a fantastic writer and a composer. Ernst Theodor Amadei Hoffman, the German writer, and he wrote the screenplay about it. He wanted to make a movie, actually a beautiful screenplay, Hoffmaniana. And it's maybe Hoffman is like Poe, for example, from English, or Washington Irving, or something. That's was his readings.
Well, I think the theme of Soviet censorship for Andrei and I, both growing up in Soviet Union, and I think Andrei was 4 years old when I was born, and that was a Brezhnev era, and it was definitely a period that's difficult to maybe understand entirely for people in the West. Certain things here we take for granted. It's just a normal sense of expression, freedom, and of course there's lots of censorship. And we did talk about Hollywood and film media as being entirely controlled in many ways by financial mechanisms. So you may not be censored in the sense of imprisonment, but you may be simply not given the budget or work here just as well. If you're trying to make things that don't quite go along with the line of whatever is considered lucrative or even politically correct here. So we do have censorship, but we still have independent film. We still have ability to speak about certain things just as we do now. In the Soviet time, is just a footnote. Yes, it's and I always wanted to underline it, and I do underline it in our previous interview in Florence. I think it's a miracle in itself that these films were made in the climate where they did designate pretty large budgets. However, we will learn from the ontology that your father managed to work sometimes with half a budget, like in Ivan's Childhood. They gave him the leftover budget of a film that he remade with half the means that were designated to make a film. But nevertheless, he was in complete control with the studio, with censorship, and constantly being subjected. And we'll talk more about this in specifics, how many corrections would be suggested to each film. Sometimes up to 30 different remarks would be given that he needed to, basically, after the film was made, they would subject him to these censorship meetings where they would require for him to basically cut, fourth or half of a film away for most ridiculous reasons. Like they mentioned flying, for example, like the spaceman in Solaris, he's flying away, and is he flying away from the Soviet country? That would be an issue. That would be a consideration even in the plot, just to tell you how much of ridiculous thought and restrictions were imposed on making of these films. So if you bring it into viewing it in context of these filters, what we're finding is that sometimes, going to your question about levitation and things like that, these things that Andrei Tarkovsky makes, which I found extremely profound and been thinking about it all along since I heard it recently, is that he sees a great meaning in the symbolism as being in a way a hindrance from a philosophical point, as Jay will probably comment on that, is if you try to use a symbol as a way of reducing something to a language of symbol, then once the symbol, that's what Tarkovsky says, once the symbol is understood, then we enter sort of this finite resolution. We have reduced the poetry, the art, the message to something that could be just like a riddle, like solved like a puzzle. And once we solve the puzzle, the infinity of it is no longer there. So some of the images, precisely the word image versus symbol, is very important to understand. What I gather from watching Andrei Jr.'s film is that the symbolism in Tarkovsky is actually the image with a capital, image as a image and likeness. So it's a greater, in Russian is a word obraz, that is the same word as image, but we have images on the screen, and we have image and likeness type of image. So that's the word that I felt he's expressing, and trying to use these images where they're not always purely symbolic at all. They do have elements of symbolism, but they take us somewhere beyond, into this almost transverbal and transrational, almost as a brushstroke, as something that only in art and rhyme of poetry and beauty sometimes just falls, logic falls short, and thus the symbol does as well. So now forgive me my rambling. Anybody there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm here.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, but I just was answering, trying to answer that, the symbolic
Right.
presences and the censorship language within the context of censorship that sort of forced it to the.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're right. That censorship, he had quite a precise idea about the West and Western way of making cinema and the money budget. For Sacrifice, that he put 3 years to close the budget. So it wasn't easy for him to find the money for Tarkovsky. Nonetheless, he was working, and because cinema is complicated. Cinema, you have to get money first of all. You have to recover money from off of the budget and make money out of the film. But it's also a tricky thing because maybe someone could say Tarkovsky's films are not commercial, but as we say, Tarkovsky's films are already 50 years are on screens and keep on going, on screens. People still going to see them. It's not like a Hollywood movie. You see it once and it's gone. Next year, there's nothing. So it's different approach. And I think, but still, yeah, it's kind of a miracle that his films were shot in Russia, but at the same thing, it's I think art is born out of a conflict. It's born out of you needed a conflict. The ideal world, art doesn't need. We don't need it anymore. It has no sense. Art in paradise doesn't exist. I think so. So it's something that. And this fight, he was doing for his film, this sublimation of years of work put in a film, and of course, a miracle of producing it. It also gives the idea that the people who worked with him understood him, and it was also the reaction to this reality that was surrounding them, and so even apparently, totalitarian society as it was. There were the ways, miraculous ways to find, especially the cinema, which was actually very expensive form of art, a very expensive form of production, paid by my government money. But still, I was reading. Actually, working on Andrei Rublev, I was reading the discussions they have about the script and the film in the Soviet Union, the discussion of artistic council of the studios in 1963. And I have to say that, first of all, the level of the people of because there were historians, art historians, film directors, colleagues, and at that time, that period, as he said in his film, the Khrushchev warmth of this period was quite stressing. Actually, they were discussing which is the best quote from the Bible you have to use in his film. And they were discussing, no, I have a better one. You have to read this. It is from the Old Testament. So the people were discussing on this on the council, on the Mosfilm studios in 1963. That's also very strange, don't you think so? Because, we get to use, yeah. And it's one day I would like to publish it because they were discussing very spiritual ideas, themes. No one were against the script. Actually, everybody wants the film to be done, and they were just suggesting the young directors how to better put it on the screen. So it's also kind of things that I don't think that any regime is totally shielded and protected and omniscient. The culture, the life is stronger than that, and that's actually what's it all about. So maybe the miracle, but maybe his films which made in Russia are miracles, but maybe not. Maybe it's just demonstrates that life is nonetheless goes on, and that true art is always helped or somehow flourishes anyway, if you have a strong belief that it should be done.
The documentary mentions at one point in 1983 that they sort of tried to subvert him at the Cannes Film Festival. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's actually I think there was Bondarchuk who went. He was a member of the jury, or even the president of the jury this time. And actually, he wasn't voting for Soviet film, which was Nostalgia, but he was trying to convince the other people from the jury to vote for another film. And I think it was Japanese film, something that took the Pandor. So that was actually striking for him, that he understood. They had Bondarchuk was his opponent somehow, ideological opponent, although they were friends, and his daughter was Hari and Solaris as an actress, Natalia Bondarchuk.
And Bondarchuk was a director, if you tell our audience.
Yes, he was a director, actor, and very famous director, the author of films like, Waterloo, and very big films, and a very big budget, very communist propaganda films, but he was very important man in Soviet Union. And ideologically, they were completely different. They were at the opposites, So there actually he opposed my father, and my father understood that if this is actually the sentiment and what was going on in Russia in his toward his art, towards his films, he understood that he will never work there. So that was actually those years was the last years of the regime. It was just before the Gorbachev perestroika. Everything was crumbling, but as all the regimes, when they're crumbling apart, they're getting much more aggressive and strong. It was a period of actually Kosygin, if I'm not wrong, actually, who came to power. Kosygin death and
Chernenko.
Yeah,
Andropov.
Well, what says Andropov? Yes, exactly. So that was a very, very difficult time. So, and I am sure if I was going back, he would be put aside, and he would never be able to make anything in cinema, at least for many years. And at that time, you didn't know that Soviet Union was falling apart. We know it now, but so that was the turning point. Actually, that was when he understood that if he had to choose, that was his also sacrifice. So it's talking about before, he sacrificed his family, sacrificed his son, me. He couldn't see him, we couldn't meet for 4 years, and he wasn't sure if he will ever meet me again. But and actually, he asked, and not directly, but he asked me, and I understood it, and I said, okay, we all agreed in the family of his decision. Nobody was jealous enough, because we knew that he was, first of all, he was an artist and a father, and it was a painful decision. But of course, seeing him struggling for years in Soviet Union for every film, and if you had a possibility, if they take it, it's very important. Nonetheless, I was a child, I understood that. So that's how it went. So he made a press conference, which is in the film, in Italy, and here started his wandering in Europe between Sweden, Italy, London, and And then France because the hospital was there. There was doctors were there.
Well, you were describing these events of separation of the family, and ultimately, and we are living in times when these events happen to kind of flood our world in a new wave of migration and refugees from the military conflict that's taking place right now in the world and in the Western world, because there are things that happen in Africa not too long ago that Western world didn't seem to be that much concerned about, which is another question of where the politics aims its attention is always it's not very objective at times, but we do see this drama taking place in history, and we see it taking place now on a very large scale, and I think it's very timely and important that we're revisiting or in a way resurrecting the work of your father, even in our humble efforts here, because pretty much all of his films are filled with anti-war sentiment, and at least 4 of the films are almost directly aimed at that. And the next generation, of course, had, if not direct, but at least personal contact with that experience. And now it seems like the next generations are entering that realm again. Maybe a few words on your father's work in that direction and his view and of the topic.
Yes, of course. Well, my father was a child, and the wartime period was very hard, of course. And they were in evacuation, so they were suffering famine, and they were living in the countryside with my grandmother. And my grandfather went to war. At a certain point, he was shot. He lost his leg. So everyone, the war left a great mark in our family. And my father, of course, was his film, as he said, which was criticized for being too pacifist. Because someone believed that the war. Some right wars should be done, and not right wars. So you can kill if you have that. It's a right cause. It's like Raskolnikov idea, as you said, so, and it's completely wrong. Yeah, and the war is a catastrophe for who begins it and who participates in a war. There are no winners in a war. That was his idea. And of course, that was. You can see it and you can sense it through his film, especially like Ivan Childhood and Sacrifice Stalker and Andrei Rublev's, of course, the medieval wars between the civil wars, and now we're living in a world which much more violent than it was before my father was alive. I mean, if you think now maybe they're not. Third World War, as someone said, it's already began because, we have wars all over the world right now. Small wars, but still not that small. So, and here we go back to this idea of our presumption to correct others and not ourselves, not correct our spirit, but and. But there's always hope that as his films, as in art, and as we all should have hope now. Although sometimes it seems that the situation is quite helpless, like everybody kind of feels sometimes these days. But we should have faith. Otherwise, it's really we let them win. The people who starts all this.
Do you feel that your father's films are healing?
Yes, I think so. Art has this healing quality. the real art, the true art. It's and maybe
sure on the notion of time and uniqueness of film as this art form that is built around time, as he calls it, and as a preservation of time and working, sculpting in time, as you mentioned, almost as Michelangelo's analogy on a marble block. But what I think is very important in this interview, that we don't end it before we give a word of warning to people who are now conditioned to view clip level, Instagramic, hyper speed, bleepy information feed that they're now been sort of conditioned to receive over hours a day. In that format, Tarkovsky film stands as a diametrical opposite, where everything is almost at the point of standstill, on the verge of time expanding and slowing down tremendously. And it is something that I feel is important for our viewers to be prepared as they go to watch Tarkovsky films. Hopefully, after they see this interview, some of those people, of course, may have seen them, but many people may have not. And what would be your advice, if you will, to the way of watching the films?
Well, you're right that it's the time, but the time of his films, it's the time of man. It's the time of our reflection, of our meditation, and the modern cinema, modern life doesn't give much time for us to think. We don't have time to think. We have 20 seconds or something. So the reflection is we're losing the capacity to be reflective and perceptive. To see, I don't know, to hear Bach passions. You have to sit to 1 hour and a half to listen. You have to, like in his films, you have to spend 1 hour and a half in silence and observe this long shots, and that's actually, I think, brings us back to ourselves, to our, as we said, to a moment of deep introspection, to a moment of prayer, to a moment of meditation about our lives, and you can do that personally, or you can do that through his films. You can, as we said before, being compassionate. You can feel and see what he was feeling and seeing as an author, as a poet in his films. It's something that we are losing this capacity because we are not given any more time. Yeah, as he was actually concerned about this problem already. He was seeing that tendency in cinema, especially espestern cinema, American cinema, the shortcuts editing. But it has nothing to do with it's the humanization of art and the humanization of our lives, and now maybe we are assisting to almost to end of it, because yes, you're right, all these Instagrams, all this internet, which totally kills the idea of interaction of one person with another. I don't think there are no more, all these people, sending messages. I think they're much more alone there than people that were writing letters or whatever, had no internet at a certain time, because there's no interaction actually. It's impossible to get a connection, to get to know someone if you have 20 seconds the message. So I think, and the cultural level showed that actually quite. quite a lot. The level of film, the level of artworks presented, everything is so superficial. It's because no one will have time anymore, to sit and everybody's doing, but much of people doesn't know what they're doing, but they have to do, because otherwise you're out of something which is it's a construction. It's a construction over a construction, and that's something that will I don't know. So how to watch my father's films? It's just as you contemplate, a sunset or sundown. Just sit and watch, and keep your heart open and your soul open and your
turn off your phone.
Turn off your phone. Turn off, switch off your time. And I think that's why he's also the idea of connection with nature, because the time of man, the time of human being, the time of a nature didn't change. We just change it ourselves artificially, but we still can get back to it, and that's the only way to do that.
Thank you. Well, as a way of adding to the theme that you mentioned, also film as a prayer. We come from the spiritual practice of prayer as something that takes tremendous effort. As any form of life requires tremendous effort to be kept alive, to be saved, to simply grow. A spiritual life requires effort, and prayer requires effort. It means remaining focused. It means slowing down. It means battling thoughts and passions and various challenging mind forms that keep flooding into our hearts and minds. Of course, with the phone in our hand, we get flooded through our psychophysical system as well. But as we enter the space of Tarkovsky films, in my opinion, very well put the description of it as prayer, not, of course, in the sense of praying while watching a film, but the film itself is read as an effort, but a good effort that will bear very good fruit, in not just my opinion, but opinion of millions of people who have seen his films and who are continually returning. And I almost never met a person who watched Tarkovsky films and never watched them again. And most of the people I spoke about the films have always revisited them and revisited it many times, myself including, finding incredible subtleties and new discoveries within them, layers and layers of small revelation. So advice is to enter a contemplative state and view it as a work of art with attention and reverence. And hopefully this conversation was helpful.
I think I took about 8 pages of notes for each one. So this could be its own small, book here with all of the notes I took.
Yes. Well, that was very nice talk. I think we have enough for for the time being. So, and now we can think. Well, later we talk and we think how we'd start with the films. But yeah, hopefully people will get back to see his films. But it's complicated now.
You mentioned that there is a way that they can see your film. Could you mention that?
Well, actually, yes. If you wish, you can see it on in America. The distributor is a Criterion Collection, so Criterion Channel have it online. So you sign in. It's their theater, online theater, and you can see it at Criterion Channel.
Yeah, I'll put a link below to that so people can go do it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's really easy. Yeah. So I don't know where else. And it also on Blu-ray of The Mirror, the last release of the Criterion. So that's well.
Well, thank you so much.
You.
I just wanted to say
thank you very much.
It's an honor.
Yes.
was
Yes.
a pleasure to talk, and I hope it will.
Yeah, we hope it's just the beginning and a great blessing. I want to share at the end. I have this plant that I really love. I got this plant about a year ago, and I even named it Plato. And it bore a lot of fruit. And it kept these.
I was keeping looking at that plant all the time.
Yeah, good. I kind of like that. We're speaking about the tree, and of course, it kind of resonated with me with a sign of hope. That's why I placed this in the shot. But of course, the cross is definitely a symbol of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge coming together. But with all that said, and all the symbolisms and meanings here, I want to share with you a little miracle. I hope it's an encouragement, because for about 6 months it had all these fruits, and last night it was just like that. But in this morning, I came in, and that one
was down.
That one was down, and it dropped. It dropped this morning. So I want to present it as a symbol of a blessing from God, as a fruit of our efforts and efforts, of course, of your father's films. And I think it's a beautiful confirmation that we're going to be doing something fruitful, and that hopefully it'll bear a lot of good fruits that shines like the sun and gives us hope and warmth and light in lives of many people, as the films of your father do. And blessings to all.
Well, thank you guys so much, and be looking for the rest of this series. We're going to be covering each of the films. In my audience, if you would, please like and share this, and go to the Criterion Collection link below and watch this. And I would add too that if you have a plant named Plato back there, I'm gonna have to get a plant back here, and I'm gonna name it Aristotle. So we can see who wins here in this battle of philosophy plants.
We'll have a School of Athens by Raphael, where they're walking side by side.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I'll go ahead and stop.